Hello, everybody. We're waiting for a few people to join the call, so we're going to start in a few minutes. Hello, everybody. We're waiting for a few people to join the call, so we're going to start in a few minutes. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being part of tonight's event, marking Human Rights Day. This is an event that Ethics in Health Tech holds every year. Last year, we had it talking about women's rights and issues concerning women's in the digital age. And this year, we're dedicating it to the conflicts in Ukraine, to the Iranian Revolution that's taking place, as well as to digital rights and freedoms in places like Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. Let me tell you why this event is important. As you may know, over 100 million people are now in need, are refugees looking for shelter, that are displaced because of war, conflict, climate change, poverty, you name it. In the West, we have corporatocracy, and in 40%, 50% of the world, the people live under authoritarian regimes. Unfortunately, because of that, we live in a world of conflict. Corporations are in it for their own self-interests, as in authoritarian regimes do all they can to stay in power. And that has a huge negative impact on us as humanitarians. I'm really grateful for the people that are on Ethics in Tech that support us. Last year, we decided that we wanted to be politically active, and being politically active meant that we could not be a nonprofit. It would be a conflict of interest. It would be electioneering. So we are an active set of organizers and activists from a variety of fields, backgrounds, ministers, technology evangelists, social media activists that take part in these forums, and we bring various issues to light. We're not backed by any entity, we're not supported by anyone, but we do support a whole bunch of organizations that do great good. And consider this first part of my talk a bit of an infomercial. You know, people ask, what can we do when we're concerned about human rights, when we're concerned about what's taking place in the world around us, besides reaching out to representatives and congressmen and diplomats, putting out petitions, asking for change. What else can we do? I want to highlight a few organizations, some that you're going to hear from tonight, including Roots Action. That's a progressive organization headed by Norman Solomon. Roots Action does great work in terms of bringing issues that matter to light, including justice and inequality, environmental issues. And Norman has been an activist for a very long time, and it's highly respected. So if you want to support an organization, consider supporting Roots Action. If you're considering other organizations, consider Media Alliance, an organization based in the East Bay headed by Tracy Rosenberg. And Tracy does great work in terms of bringing light to digital divide of what's taking place in big tech. And she's going to be speaking later on this evening. If you're a person of faith or not, atheist, agnostics, and you want to find a community that you can belong to, that you can take part in, consider joining the Church of Fellowship of All People with Reverend Dorsey Blake. It's an interdenominational interfaith organization. It's one of the oldest organizations in the US, started by a reverend, or black reverend and white reverend, getting together and deciding to bring people together of all denominations, of all faiths. And I go there to get inspiration and get motivated for the work that we do. If you're interested in reading good content, I always recommend reading Common Dreams with Brett Wilkins. He has been active with Ethics in Tech since day one. He produces a lot of great articles and content that's worthwhile reading and staying in tune with. He covers the protests in Iran. He covers the ethics in the tech community, and he is a major contributor to Ethics in Tech Online, and a major contributor to the book Ethics in Tech and Lack Thereof that we co-authored. In terms of other organizations that lend us their voice and retweet our content, I would like to mention Electronic Frontier Foundation. Electronic Frontier Foundation protects civil rights and civil liberties online. They defend organizations like the Internet Archive, which is an online book library and content library. And they do great work. They sue the NSA, they stand up for the little guy, they stand up to the patent trolls, and we're part of the Electronic Frontier Alliance. Again, we don't receive any financial assistance from anyone or seek it. We just want to highlight the work that they do. Of course, there's organizations like the ACLU. When Iranians couldn't get into this country and borders were shut down under the previous administration, ACLU went out to the airports in San Francisco and other cities and helped address legal challenges that refugees from Iran and migrants were facing at the time. So with that said, I would like to introduce our first guest. She is a woman rights activist, and her father flew on behalf of the Shah back in the 70s, and he refused to salute the Islamic Republic, and she now lives in Oklahoma. So she put out an interesting petition earlier this year for Hijab Day, and I thought, Sonia, if you could be kind enough to give overview of what's going on in Iran when it comes to women's rights, and what was about your petition and what you highlighted in your work.
Hi, Mr. Razavi. Thank you for inviting me here today. I'm sure most of you know what's happening in Iran right now. The death of a young woman named Mahsa Amini is what sparked this massive revolution. She was murdered for wrongfully wearing her hijab, which was a subjective law where it could be just a little bit of hair, or she could be complying exactly with what they say, but it's an illegitimate government. So I just want to make that clear. So there's not really any legal democracy of any sort happening in Iran. She was murdered, and you saw many protests happen internationally to spread awareness of the Iranian Revolution. And I saw that a councilwoman in Boston had made Mahsa Amini's birthday as Hijab Day. And I'm sure anyone can see how tone deaf that is and opportunistic that is for someone to do that. And I couldn't really let myself be silent about it. So I was able to contact her through a Zoom meeting I interrupted some meetings she had going on within her community, and was able to send that to a news agency that reports about Iran, and that received massive attention. And because of that, a lot of people were calling her office internationally and complaining. And at this point, it's hard for me to give benefit of doubt to people that don't understand what's going on in Iran, especially in this day and age. I used to give benefit of doubt before, but at this point, I would consider it willful ignorance. Despite the thousands of people calling her office, she still was adamant about keeping her birthday as Hijab Day, and then reluctantly changed it to Women Life Freedom Day. But superficially, on the surface, that's fine. But the core purpose of her using it as like her birthday as Women Life Freedom Day, she still said that it was for the purpose of combating Islamophobia, to educate people, to utilize it as a tool, which to me, that is still disrespectful. She's using it for her own agenda still, although she changed the name. But there's only so much I could do at that point. But because of that, I'm glad that I was able to spark some sort of attention to that and stop her from letting her die in vain. And I've noticed that a lot of issues that the Iranian people are having now with getting news out is social media censoring, and which I think is relevant to the ethics in tech mission. I've noticed that there's a lot of censorship going on, a lot of bribery going on, people trying to censor certain accounts to not spread what's going on from Iran. And even when things do get spread out, certain journalists or news agencies will still pick out the few people that are the mouthpieces of the regime. So it's like muffling the voices of the people and cherry picking who can represent Iran. And it's really hurtful to the protests going on. But thankfully, because of social media, the truth is coming out. And no matter how hard Iran tries to cover up what's going on and silence the people, it's still coming out, and it's unstoppable at this point. I've tried my best to educate my non-Iranian friends, people around me, about the history of Iran, because I've tried to put myself in the shoes of a normal American that's born here, and based off what they know about the Middle East, how they would view Iran. I understand they would think that Iran is a typical Middle Eastern country, kind of war-torn and not very advanced, but in this circumstance, I would say that knowledge is definitely power here. And if only they knew, like, I think we should all try to educate them, because if they only understood that the history of Iran is very long, and previous to this revolution, the 1979 revolution, it was very modernized. It was an ally with the United States for many, many years and many presidents in a row. And I've noticed that the regime preys on the ignorance of the world regarding this in order to have them align with their agenda. I've noticed a lot of US senators or political figures of the United States aligning or doing things for the Iranian government without knowing that they're doing wrong, because they don't know any better. And I think in that it's best for us to educate others regarding Iran and not be upset. But as I said before, it's at this point halfway willful ignorance, because Google does exist, and it does become a bit exhausting to have to explain everything to someone. But just to give them resources, what to look for when hearing about Iranian news, try to use social media and directly from the people, instead of CNN or central news agencies that kind of filter out the truth, is what I've noticed. And also, for example, Hillary Clinton, her recent interview with, I think, CNN regarding Iran, in her opinion, she was stating that the people want, I think, reform, she mentioned as that term, and she was hoping that there could be internal talks. And again, this is all legitimizing the Islamic Republic, which this is not a democracy. There are no internal talks of reform. It's a dictatorship. And people like her, it's really starting off what the people want. And I think we need to quickly correct those that try to muffle the voices and what the truth is. The people want a revolution. They don't want reform. They want revolution. That is the only solution. And I think people really need to understand that it is a dictatorship, and when they want accurate numbers or fact checking, this is a major issue we came across with certain news agencies with I think it was 15,000 people at risk of execution. They were saying, oh, the number is not correct. No one has verified this. I would like to ask those individuals who exactly they think they're dealing with, because they're not going to have a dictatorship tell them, like, ribbon drop at their doorstep that, oh, this is actually how many people we're going to kill today. It's I don't know why they won't look at history or trust the people, because the same thing happened, I believe, in 1988. It was basically a genocide happening again. But I'm very happy to see that the momentum has built up since, I think it was September that it started. I'm very, very happy to see how well built the revolution has become and worldwide recognition of it. I definitely see a free Iran in the future, and I think we should stay focused and consistent and faithful that we'll have a free Iran. So.
Thank you so much, Sonia. You know, just want to highlight a few facts. Over 60 kids have died, 500 have been killed in these protests. I think the number now is over 18,000 people that have been arrested in less than 3 months. Mahsa Amini's birthday is next Friday, so that will be actually a 3-month mark of this revolution. And not a single member of the government has been held accountable for these deaths, for these imprisonments. And they use blunt force, tear gas, rubber bullets, pellet guns, real live bullets against these protesters. They even break the tombstones, and the protesters have to bury their dead in the middle of the night and then have their tombstones broken by the regime. So not even the dead have mercy. Unfortunately, you know, Iran also washes its hands in blood of the Russians in Ukraine by sending arms and technology with the drones to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure, which is really an act of war against the civilian population of Ukraine. So I think it's important to highlight those for people to understand that it is a mass incarceration, mass murder at the hand of a regime, and people need to be aware of that. That's why there are weekly protests all over the world against the Islamic Republic. And let me remind everyone that this generation that you see protesting in Iran, they were raised under the Islamic Republic. They knew the consequences of resisting this regime. They learned the best from the mullahs, and they let them learn their Quran, yet they had morality police going in and enforcing the morality of their mullahs on the youth, and they didn't want to have any part of it. Could you imagine, you know, being raised in a religious school with Islam that's practiced by the Shia faith, and then going into a van for 30 minutes to 2 hours of indoctrination that they provide with breaking your arms, legs, rapes, and outright torture. And you see some of the pictures, some of the folks that have been arrested, they're professors, they're actors, they're artists. Those are the ones that the regime is going after, the educated class. You know, it's the students that are doing the uprisings. It's the students that are getting in the streets and throwing their food on the ground and making sure they can commingle with their fellow students, regardless if they're man or woman. And so it's truly a revolution, and we'll see where it goes. But no country can oppress its people forever. Sooner or later, it has to change. And I hope for that change to be sooner, because the toll on the people is just too immense. Next, I'd like to ask Reverend Blake to say a few words. Reverend Blake, I would love to hear what your thoughts are on Human Rights Day. I think you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Oh, yes.
Even with the mask on, I'm covering some scars, okay? First of all, it is indeed a pleasure to be here, to be part of Ethics in Text, and this annual now commemoration of Human Rights Day. I think it's very important because a lot of times we forget about human rights. And human beings do have rights. Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. It is interesting that the Human Rights Declaration was issued on December 10th, 1948, through the General Assembly of the United Nations. It really is an extraordinary document, one would say a milestone, which proclaims that the inalienable rights that everyone is entitled to, that it proclaims that as a human being, regardless of race, color, religion, sex, language, political, or other reasons, national, social origin, property, birth, or other status. It is available in more than 500 languages. It's the most translated document in the world. Political document, that is. It is amazing that this was done in 1948. Even more amazing is the idea that in 1918, after the end of World War II, it helped to end World War II, there was the Armistice Day, the armistice that was held. And on November the 11th, 11 day, it was declared that we should quit killing people, that war was no longer a way to solve problems. This sentiment was picked up by even General Douglas MacArthur. President Dwight Eisenhower reiterated the fact that the military-industrial complex had really gotten way out of control. It was echoed by John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, so many others, that war is no way to solve any conflict. We must, as human beings, learn to respect each other as human beings and work for nonviolent solutions to the conflicts that nations face. It is very interesting to me, though, that while there is this legacy of peace in this country, of people yearning for peace, there is, on the other side, clearly a culture of violence. And that culture of violence is fed by our government, by the awful budgets that we have. Like recently, the Senate and the House agreed to increase by $45 billion the amount for the national NDAA, and that increases the amount given to $847 billion. This is $45 billion more than even Biden had asked for, which is more than what Trump had asked for and received. So it's interesting that we seem to be appalled by the violence in this nation, except we keep feeding it. It is interesting to me that violence takes many forms. In this country, senior poverty, that's violence. There are 37 million older adults who do not have enough money to make ends meet. That's 1 in 3 seniors simply cannot afford to pay for utilities, rent, medication, and food. there have been 611 mass shootings so far this year. And we can talk about the people who are responsible for these mass shootings, but it's a logical conclusion when our nation solves its problems through violence. That is the example that many of these young people and the people who commit these atrocities are seeing. And it's one of the issues that Martin Luther King had to deal with in that amazing speech of his, Beyond Vietnam. He talked about, how can I talk to the people in the ghetto about violence when our nation, this nation, is the most violent nation in the world? Have the largest mass incarceration of any other nation. So when I look at the idea of this type of money, and according to Brown University, I think $8 trillion in one place, $14 trillion spent on the war in Afghanistan that we pulled out 20 years later, and were the people any better off? Think of how much money, how many houses that could have provided for homeless people with the support services needed. Think of how many jobs could be created, how many young people could go to college on just part of that. So we create this atmosphere of violence, and then we seem to be shocked for a few days when these kinds of things occur, the mass shootings. It is interesting that it seems to me that one of the culprits in all of this is our media, our commercial media, which seems to also be bought by massive corporations in this nation. I was looking, and when I realized that Norman Solomon was going to be part of this panel tonight, I said to myself, how many times has CNN or MSNBC asked Norman Solomon for commentary, to be one of the panelists analyzing what is going on? Even Ralph Nader. Medea Benjamin? No. Joy LaRue? No. So we only get this idea that only two parties worth listening to, Republican or Democrat. The others don't count. And that keeps us from building the kind of alternative movement that needs to be built. But I will say that movement is growing stronger and stronger. I happen to be on the National Council of Elders, and in October, we held our annual meeting at the Alex Haley Farm in Clinton, Tennessee, with young organizers. And they are very committed to a new kind of world, a new kind of order. We just need to hear more about that and connect the dots. Sonia talked about what is happening in Iran, and I'm glad that you brought that up, and so Vahid, who talked so passionately about what is going on. And there has been in this country, for example, a lot of people who are saying, perhaps not enough at times, right, Vahid, who are also appalled by what is happening there. So many are appalled by what is happening in Ukraine. But we forget very easily that what we have done in Ukraine is of what Russia has done. I'm sorry, I certainly don't want to support Russia or Putin in what they're doing, but we forget about Iraq. We forget about Afghanistan and the refugees created there. We forget about the fact that we continue to support Saudi Arabia and its bombing of Yemen, this kind of thing. So we need to be more comprehensive in our understanding. And it's only as we condemn ourselves, it's only as we look at our own record that we can really move forward with any kind of authenticity. We talked about the fear. We still do fear that Putin might unleash nuclear weapons. Yes, we should be afraid of that. But at the same time, remember who has unleashed a nuclear weapon? Who has destroyed 2 cities, hundreds of thousands of people? We evaporated human beings, evaporated buildings. We took the heads off of children that the mothers were trying to carry to safety through our bombs. So this is the time for us to really be serious about going forward by looking at what we have accomplished, what we have done as a nation ourselves. But think of the jobs that could be created with the money that goes to the Pentagon. Remember in 1967, 66, 67, Dr. Martin Luther King, Asa Phillips, and Bayard Rustin put together a peace budget, a freedom budget, they called it, that would guarantee an annual income or jobs if you could not work. It guaranteed jobs. It guaranteed a quality of life, not just minimum wages, but a quality of life. All human beings need to have some kind of quality of life, not just subsistence. And we can do it on our budget. That is the exciting thing. We have the budget that we can do all these things to allow human beings to really be human and to fulfill their potential. We have the possibility. We have not had the will. And that is what we need to work on. But he talked about our church just a little bit. Yes, it was co-founded on the idea that we wanted people to come. And it's not just to tolerate people from various traditions. We wanted people who were different. We wanted people from different nationalities, genders, racial background, class backgrounds, because our idea was that if people came together for an extended time period and had genuine fellowships, spiritual gatherings, that there would exist among them, that would create among them a kind of unity or common ground that would undercut all of the socially imposed divisions by which we live and which often divide us. This is a great time for us. And I want to say the other thing is, Sonia, when we look at these, years ago, an associate said to me, if you want to look at the history of war, look at the history of religion, because in many ways they are connected. I think in the last few years, maybe not so much so, but they have been connected. But all these regimes that use religion, and I want us to understand they're using religion. It's not the religion itself, but it's the use of it. Islam is a very beautiful religion. It's a religion that talks about peace. That's what it means. It's a religion that talks about submitting to that thing that brought us together in life, the great mystery, but it's been misused. Christianity was used by the Ku Klux Klan to justify its raiding. It's been used by the MAGA folks, the people who stormed the Capitol. That's not Christianity. That's a total distortion of Christianity. So we need to understand that too. But because there have been such distortions, it is difficult to bring people together again across these barriers because there's so much. We have so many ex-Catholics, in our congregation, and it's because those institutions were abusive in terms of not allowing LGBTQ people to assert themselves, to anti-women, all these kinds of things. That's not in the religion. That is the cultural appropriation for one's own benefit that is going on. So I do want to say that. And I really feel as though what we're doing here tonight is very, very important. I compliment Vahid for his perseverance in terms of holding these forums, and I'm looking forward to hearing everybody else. I have certainly been a fan of Norman Solomon's for a long, long, long time, a person with deep integrity. And I've gotten to know Brett Williams, another person with deep integrity through these conversations. I think I'll say one other thing, and I'll just put it out there. There is an author, he's a Brazilian EO poet. We would say it's Ruben Alves, Alves. And in one of the books he writes about the fact that at one point, the dinosaur was the biggest and best and most powerful animal in existence. What happened? It became extinct. We only know it now by its fossils. Why did it become extinct? It became extinct because it was not able to adjust to its environment, the changes that were going on. And so it was a model that did not fit the needs of the environment. And I look at that and I push that because I think we need to more clearly as a nation look at the fact that we're not adjusting. That's part of what happened, again, January the 6th. People cannot adjust to the fact that people of color are becoming the majority, gay, lesbian, and are becoming more and more vocal and taking a place at the table, and they cannot adjust. And neither can, and what I'm arguing for too is we have to be careful about our political system because I'm not sure it can adjust. If it keeps clinging to this two-party system, there cannot be freedom based upon that two-party system. We need to understand that very clearly and present alternatives to the system under which we presently live. Creative alternatives, intentional alternatives, alternative economies, alternative political realities, alternative cultural expressions. Thank you. You're muted.
Thank you so much, Reverend Blake, for your wisdom. It's amazing how religion is used to oppress is people and bring division. As a man of cloth and as a reverend, I'm sure you've seen what has happened in Ireland, what happens in Iran, in Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, and the voice of the peaceful imams are silenced by the thugs that want to rule and mix politics and religion. And I never think that two of them should mix. Religion and spirituality is a matter of personal relationship with God. And as soon as you bring the state into it, you bring a whole level of corruption. Do that. So go ahead.
If I can say this one thing, I hear you in terms of the state, but at the same time, and I shouldn't say but, I say and at the same time, people of religious faith have a responsibility to bring the changes they need to bring in a society. Yes. And Christianity is the whole kingdom of God. Martin Luther King was very much involved, not as a politician, but in the politics of the nation in terms of trying to create what he called the beloved community. So I think that, yes, the personal and the social must adhere. They influence each other. My personal quest for whatever to come in greater fulfillment is dependent too on how I treat my brothers and my sisters in the world. And you'd asked me, and I'm going to do this before I close, because you'd asked me to do something very special, and that was to have a moment of silence for all those people who live under authoritarian dictatorships and to live in places like the United States that might not might not have an official authoritarian situation, but also can be extraordinarily abusive. So just have a moment of silence for all the victims of societal machinations and systemic oppression. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Blake. Well, next we're going to have Norman Solomon. Norman, I think you got on a couple of minutes late. I was bragging about all the great work that Roots Action does and the fact that you founded it and you're an author and a true activist. So what's your perspective on Human Rights Day?
Yeah, well, many thanks to everybody who's making our gathering possible this evening. Vahid, I know that ethics in tech has been something that you have nurtured for many years. And I remember fondly when we got together in person in San Francisco, as well as it's been a while now, 2 or 3 times online. I keep thinking about the simplicity and the complexity of focusing on a single standard of human rights. It sounds really easy. Yeah, we're just gonna have a single standard. But in the real world, or what passes for the real world, we have all these intervening filters that knock that just out of the box. We've got racial, we've got gender, we have ethnic, we have religious, we have nationalism, we have ideology. And all of those filters knock us off course, knock humanity, I should say, off course, where that single standard needs to exist. As everybody who's spoken so far has articulated, human rights are right in front of us as an imperative. And the United Nations has put it forward. There have been innumerable documents, not just in this century, but the last century and ones before, people questing for, struggling for, with great difficulty quite often, establishing what are human rights, what is a single beacon, the North Star, whatever we want to call it, that has a constellation of human rights that we can all refer to, we can all demand adherence to, and call out any actions which are in contradiction and violation of those standards of human rights. And part of the huge problem we have, of course, here in the United States is a corporate mass media and a political government establishment and enormous profit taking from weapons sales and from the military industrial intelligence complex, sales to dictatorships around the world, the United States being the largest single arms dealer overseas. When Reverend Blake talks about a culture of violence, I think that resonates profoundly in terms of the globe, in terms of inside the United States. If only we could have an outcry similar and of the same magnitude about the very justified demands for gun control in the United States. What about gun control at the Pentagon? It's just not even on the media agenda. I have not been able to find a single member of Congress who has stood up and said, even though 200 or 300 of them at times stand up and say, we must have gun control, handguns, assault weapons, and quite properly saying we have to have children be able to go to school and not fear being attacked by someone with an arsenal of weapons. And yet I can't find a single member of Congress or a major media commentator in big media outlets saying, what about gun control at the Pentagon? You know, we have this $800 million, and that doesn't include a lot of the nuclear weapons spending, the ultimate big guns, $800 billion a year, and it's rising. And so no gun control at all. What is being done with those weapons? And I said, and I've only partly been accurate here, guns sales, weapons sales, weaponry sales to dictatorships, not only to many other countries as well. And so we have the two-faced presentations. It's bipartisan, happens to be a Democrat in the White House right now, campaigning on, no, we're not going to sell weapons or support the government of Saudi Arabia. Right? And then we get a fist bump a few months ago with the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia and President Biden. And we're supposed to believe, oh, not a big deal, you know, where there is horrendous torture in Saudi Arabia going on right now. What about Egypt? We rarely hear about the torture in Egypt. What a big receiver of US aid, including military alliance in effect. What about, you know, you travel across Sinai and Gaza, you get to Israel, the occupation and suppression of Palestinian people. We have, you know, nationalism, we have racism, we have religious bigotry, all sort of layered across to make that okay. And this is out of a political establishment or media establishment, largely institutional religious establishment in this country, Jewish establishment, the what Zionist Christian establishment now. We're saying, oh yeah, go Israel, go. And meanwhile, you have into the millions of Palestinian people living under subjugation and oppression and occupation that's gone on for now, what, more than half a century, one decade after another. And this really goes back, I think, to the failure and the opportunity for a single standard of human rights. and we look at the US role around the planet, and we see sometimes it has upheld human rights, often it has subsidized the wanton suppression of human rights. I can't think of a more essential human right than not having bombs fall in your neighborhood from on high, financed courtesy of Uncle Sam, US taxpayers. And then we go through the history. And having been to briefly Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, when I think of people who are suffering under the repression and the violence that they have had to endure, is just horrific. From the media standpoint, human rights too often in this country becomes very abstracted, as though those aren't really people. And I think we've all had that experience. If we've traveled overseas and we go to a country for the first time, we have some images, and it goes to a very superficial level because that's our experience. It's mass mediated, so to speak. And then we get there and it's like, oh, wow, these are real people. You're like us, huh? What's going on here? They're different than us, but they're human, and we're all human, which is risk being a cliche, but absolutely true. And so part of the quest of the propagandist is to convince people overtly or subtly that some people are much more human than others, and that some other people just don't count. They literally and figuratively don't count. And so who's counting the number of people who have directly and indirectly been killed courtesy of US taxpayers? If we go to the Cost of War project at Brown University, it's just stunning. You see a direct death toll, directly killed by the US war on terror, about 950,000 people, about 1 million people. And the Brown studies emphasize that's directly, because there's the cascading effect, the destruction of the infrastructure and nutrition and the environment and housing, and all those domino effects is apparently several times that. And yet the single standard of human rights is so difficult. I mean, why is that controversial? It's controversial, for some of it is psychological reasons. A lot of it is controversial in our country because it would disrupt the political economy of the massive profits being made by arms sales to the Pentagon and what the military-industrial intel complex is. And I think that's one of the great values of ethics in tech, is that more and more Silicon Valley, or whether it's up around Seattle or whatever, quite literally, it's part of a technological, political, and military trend where more and more it's a digitized militarism, and in so many different respects. And we've seen that in terms of NSA and different ways that surveillance and drones and so forth, it congeals together into this massive profitability. And so really violation of human rights, contempt for human rights in practice, not rhetorically, is extremely lucrative. And we know about these revolving doors. People in Congress or on congressional committees, they revolve in and out, and the swinging door moves in both directions with contractors who are around the Pentagon, Northern Virginia. They sprung up after 9/11 around BWI near the NSA headquarters, Fort Meade and all that. They're just having a ball. They're making not just 6 figures, 7 figures. They're making a tremendous amount of money off violating human rights. And so we live in a kind of, in its own American style way, a dystopian world where violation of human rights, the more violations, the more profitable, because the more weapons, the more profitable. And when we see the US media coverage, say, of Saudi Arabia, I mean, this is kid's glove coverage. I mean, of course, the Khashoggi killing was outrageous and should be condemned. And also the torture and killing of so many others should be condemned. And then we get to the war on Yemen. And at FAIR, the Media Watch Group FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, was a study done just a couple of years ago, MSNBC. And MSNBC is surging in popularity. It's especially popular among Democratic Party aligned liberal left viewers. And MSNBC spent 5,000% as much time on Russiagate during a 1 year period than on Yemen. Virtually no coverage, almost no coverage whatsoever for an entire year on MSNBC of the cholera epidemic, the worst essentially in history, the bombing coming from essentially US-backed forces led by Saudi Arabia, extremely profitable. And one would think, well, if the United States is involved, then it would be more newsworthy from US media. No, that's actually the opposite. The more culpability from the White House in human rights violations, the less coverage we get. And so that is, a paradigm. And I certainly agree there should be more coverage of the horrendous human rights violations in Iran. Right? I mean, we should get way more coverage than we get. And that should be very explicit about what is at stake, what is being done to human beings there. If you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, when Sadat was busy, when the US was toasting, US presidents were toasting with the Shah, while the Shah's regime was torturing people, that didn't get coverage at all, hardly, in the US, as is the case with many decades of US support, past and present, for torturers, for governments of torture, which in the present day includes, but hardly confined to in the Middle East, what's going on now in Egypt, what's going on in Saudi Arabia. And so I come back to the challenge that we have, and I think I'll close on this note. As activists, as writers, as speakers, as leaders in various facets of life, there's tremendous pressure to be quiet, to tone down, to speak partial truth, to not become perhaps unpopular in certain quarters or irritate people. But the fact is that as we have, as Reverend Blake said, a culture of violence, it's also a culture of death. This is a death culture. The United States of America, the political economy, the profits made from a death culture. And we're going to rage against the killing of the light. And when we work together, we have a lot of opportunities to create the kind of future that we desperately need.
Thank you, Norman. Yeah, well, definitely, I can tell you on behalf of Ethics in Tech activists and people that have participated in our events, we're definitely not a quiet bunch. I got a megaphone that's about a third of my size, and I go to these protests, and with a cane, I carry it, and I'm very proud of it against the Iranian regime. But at one point I wanted to make about the conversation you just had was, if you remember the non-aligned nations, Yugoslavia was aligned with Russia, Iran was aligned with the US. And within a decade, both countries fell, both countries got into turmoil. The IMF wouldn't back loans for Yugoslavia, and they had financial problems. And while they brought down the wall in Germany, it disseminated. And in Iran, they shipped us back Ayatollah Khomeini, put a religious zealot in charge of the country that had no basis for running a nation, and no knowledge of economy or no knowledge of anything. And they started the Iraq War, where a million Iranians and Iraqis died just in the name of profit. So, I think the whole world has the East and the West have taken full advantage of the countries in the middle. Let it be Afghanistan, let it be Iraq, let it be Ukraine, let it be Syria with Russia's involvement, Iran's involvement. And what I said earlier is that, Iran doesn't have clean hands. Iran is just as responsible for the atrocities that are taking place in Ukraine, as well as its own country now. And Russia started this war, but They got bold after what happened in Syria and also what happened in Iraq. And of course, we get bolder every time there's a conflict because we want to sell more guns. You know, they call the merchant of death, this prisoner swap that we just did. And frankly, I think Joe Biden has sold over $100 billion in guns from 50% of it from 4 major manufacturers this past year. So when you think about the size of the military sales that we're doing, and the Russians are doing the same, Europeans are doing the same, the Israelis are doing the same, Iranians are doing the same, you know, every day we expect progress towards peace by selling more guns, and it's not going to happen. So I really appreciate your participation, Norman. We're going to have a quick chat after everybody gets to talk. Next, we have Tracy Rosenberg. Tracy, I gave a little pitch about you from Media Alliance and all the great work that you do in terms of digital rights and privacy and bringing attention to things that matter in the digital age. And I know you're in the East Coast, so it's late out there, but thanks for being on, Tracy. It's so good to see you. Happy holidays.
Thank you so much for having me here, Fahid. And yes, it's late on the East Coast and I'm sleepy, but I've got myself propped up and I think I can make it to the Q&A. All right. So when I think about Human Rights Day, I think about the activists who protect human rights and the things that they need to be able to do. And I think those things fall into two sort of broad buckets. And the first I would, sort of loosely categorize as witnessing and documenting. And of course, the reasons why we have to do that are obvious. Reality is contested. It's contested in real time, and it's contested for years and centuries after it happens. The second is speaking up, rising out, and organizing. All social change is based on finding people of like minds and organizing to take collective action together. But in doing these things, we have to use tools, and a lot of my work is about those tools and how they work and who has control of them and what the rules are of the road are about sort of how they function and in whose interests they work. So the majority of the tools that we use to communicate, to organize, to witness, to document, and to protect are owned by corporations. That's the reality. And these corporations are sometimes, and we are seeing this more and more in the areas of privacy and surveillance, deeply enmeshed with state power in ways that are increasingly becoming transparent and in ways that haven't even risen to the surface yet. And so the question of both sort of the short-term issue of, how do we carve out enough space in these corporate areas that we can continue to do human rights work. And then the much, broader question of, how are these necessary tools basically sabotaging us before we even start because of their ties and networks and connections to the very same state powers and corporate powers that are oppressing us in the first place. So you have that sort of metaphor, which has been said many times, but I think actually works in this space of how do we use the master's tools to take down the master? And even can we? And the second part of this is whether there are ways that we can build tools for human rights that aren't controlled by corporations, that don't work with state power, that are independent, that are free, that are accountable to no one but us. And certainly, in all kinds of sectors, and independent, the media is one that that Norman, for one, has talked about quite a bit, and Brett works at Common Dreams. We've sort of had the idea that if we stayed away from the corporate model, we would be able to say and do and work for things in a very different way. And that is both partially true and partially extremely challenging. And probably Brett can talk about that in ways I can't even, imagine. But, there's also the question of sort of, can we create interactive communications tools, websites, private messaging, preservation and archival systems, social media, in ways that are absolutely free of these completely destructive structures. And yes, there's a whole bunch of people working on it, and there are really endless challenges. One, of course, is scale, because if you're taking on a government, scale is important. And the second is, the kind of co-opting that pretty much always happens. Once upon a time, WhatsApp was an independent platform with the best end-to-end encryption in the world, and human rights activists depended on it. A couple years later, it's part of Facebook. Now you're an idiot if you use WhatsApp. Seriously. And people still do. I know. And in theory, it's still end-to-end encrypted. But look who's in charge and what that means. So there's kind of, a repetitive cycle where things are created that seem better than what came before them. But over time, the capitalist system in which we live sort of grinds them into the mainstream and puts human rights activists at risk, on an ongoing basis. So I guess what I would say is that, in terms of the work that I do, we continue to sort of try to, carve space in the sense of what are the rules of the road and how can we try to establish those in ways that leaves a little bit of room for freedom of expression, a little bit of room for dissent, and a little bit of room for organizing against the state without being dragged off to a rubber room. And, long term, how can we sort of liberate communication tools so that they are not, in fact, the tools of the master and of the oppressor, but it's something that genuinely belongs to people and works in the interests of people. I don't really have the answer, except that I think that's the answer. And I think that's the direction that we have to go. And it's going to be a big job getting there. So I know that, let's see, my time on paper was up quite a while ago, but I think I'm going to kind of stop there. And if there's Q&A on some of this, we can talk about it a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely, Tracy. I'm so glad to see you. And thank you for all the work that you do with Media Alliance. Hopefully people will support your organization, learn more about it. I love following you and all the content you put out. It's greatly appreciated. And thank you so much. And next, the speaker is Peter Kaufman. Peter and I met at Internet Archive, an organization that I would highly recommend you follow. Internet Archive archives the web. And Peter was giving a presentation on the status of democracy in this country. And I thought it would be great to have Peter join us. Peter is author of a couple of books, and I'm not going to share his full bio, but Peter, welcome. I know you're in the East Coast as well, so thank you for making yourself available.
Thank you, Vahid, for organizing this important event and on this important day. Yes, I'm on the East Coast, but with enough bourbon, we can all get through it. The thing I want to focus on in my 10 minutes tonight is a tiny intervention. It's something. It's about the most important thing that's ever happened in world history that pretty much nobody knows about. Although I think Reverend Blake, maybe some of the others on this this evening may know about it. And And I want to remind us of this thing because it was a thing that happened as the world, and let me say this to you, especially my old friend, Vahid. The world that I know has an unreasonably Eurocentric focus, but this is a thing that was happening as that world was sliding fast into fascism the last time around, about 90 years ago. So the primordial challenge we face with human rights, I think, is in that declaration, that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which a number of our speakers have alluded to tonight. It was pulled together in the wake of the Second World War, but it had roots before that, as Reverend Blake was saying. And it's that, and I'm quoting, the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Now, as documents go, that was written by a committee. That's pretty good. It is a text, it's a piece of text, and how we've lived up to it is pretty much the subject of what we're talking about tonight, but it's a pretty good statement. And it's pretty true, I think. But I want to mention like a precursor to this Universal Declaration, indeed to UNESCO and the United Nations as a whole. And that is the work of a little committee and then a little institute considered by historians of UNESCO today. If you're a historian of UNESCO today, my heart, goes out to you. How'd you wind up there? But it's a pretty fascinating organization. To be like this committee and this institute was one of the foundations of UNESCO, and thus one of the progenitors, if you will, of the modern understanding and the international legal regime that protects the human rights, or allegedly protects the human rights that we're honoring today. Before I just mention this committee and this institute, let me say the following. 20 million Americans believe now that armed insurrection against the federal government is warranted. Even more believe that recent national elections we had were illegitimate. How did we get to this point? It's a point where, as has been mentioned, this is the challenge about going, fifth with a group like this, where 1 million plus Americans are dead from COVID, many of them because they believe the disease wasn't real and the vaccines were a hoax. It's a point where so many people still believe that the market will fix the problems that the unregulated market has caused. It's a point where an American president can lead a mob to storm the Capitol and to hang his vice president. I mean, this is some operatic shit. And unleash the forces that propel an assassin into the home of the Speaker of the House. You're not born a Trump voter. You're not born hating Blacks, Jews, Mexicans, Catholics, or the redheaded, the left-handed, whatever. Like, you're not. You're socialized into it by what you hear and what you learn from your family, your church, school, information you hear, you read, you see on television, radio, newspapers, magazines, the web, social media. And if that's true, as I think it is, that you're not born, most of us, with any particular sort of prejudice or hatred in our hearts, we may be better able to understand our current predicament by delving more deeply into something called the sociology of knowledge, which is a field born in the 1920s and 1930s under the rising specter of fascism in Central and Eastern Europe. So in a new book that I'm writing, so it's okay to stay up late, Vahid, we're writing all these. I'm trying to resurrect some approaches from the thinkers of that time and trying to apply them to better understand how we might unthink some of what we thought, and also how we might develop a kind of new sociology of paradigm change to help along our understanding of the current chaos of misinformation, disinformation, the whole epistemic crisis we're in. And this brings me back to UNESCO and my tiny intervention tonight. The poet Archibald MacLeish, our former Librarian of Congress, wrote in a line that's enshrined now with a slight gender correction as the UNESCO Charter's preamble. Since war begins in the minds of men, he wrote, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. And that line comes out of what he knew was going on at this little known group from the 1920s, which was there in Geneva, where the United Nations, then known as the League of Nations, was first based. It was created in 1922. It was called the International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation. It was a consultative body of the League of Nations. And in 1926, the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation was founded in Paris to serve as that as executive branch. It's considered to be one of the foundations of UNESCO, which is still based in Paris. Who are members? Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, Marie Curie, Paul Valéry, the French poet, Henry Bergson, Gilbert Murray, Aldous Huxley, Thomas Mann, others from Mexico, Brazil, China, and India. Their work was attuned to a particularly grave moment in human existence, as they called it. And what they said was, in this document, like, for example, which is an archival document from Geneva, that the League of Nations assumes that there is a League of Minds, a successor to the Republic of Letters of the original Enlightenment. And I'm going to read you for 1 minute something from this and then close. The League of Minds is not a fiction. It has always existed. The essence even of the thought that is most solitary, that is elaborated in the greatest secrecy and the most jealous independence, is communication of itself, is its power to stir far off harmonies and affinities, or even the contrary reactions that vindicate its quality. And these guys go on to talk about the city of the intellect that they're trying to create. The interests of science, the intellectual interests of men and of science, constitute a scattered nation that is nevertheless more solid and more compact than certain political formations. It's pretty powerful stuff. And it goes directly, or the line goes directly from this kind of thinking to create a League of Minds to, the things that are enshrined in Article 19, that everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression, and that right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, orally in writing or in print, in the form of art or through any other media of choice. This is the thing that matters most to me. And so I'm echoing some of the stuff that others have said, which is this communication, this freedom of communication, this freedom of knowledge. And, the ways in which we, for example, are getting together tonight, assembling in this way this evening. So that is most severely under threat everywhere around the world. And I think that we would do well to, resuscitate this League of Minds with the broader, maybe gender and color and other things balance. Explore the sociology of knowledge that these guys in Central and Eastern Europe were developing, and revisit maybe again the world's commitment to some of the language in Article 19 as we put away people like or chase them to their deaths like Aaron Swartz or Julian Assange or cancel people like, it's a dangerous world we're living in, and we're not helping it along by our policies and with respect to media. So thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Peter. No, it's the League of Minds would be wonderful if countries didn't try to shut down the internet access of their people. So when you look at places like Iran, like China, like North Korea, and elsewhere, freedom of the internet is controlled. And here in the States, we have our own level of censorship and monitoring. But it's kind of hard to exchange ideas when people can't even get on social media and share content because of what powers it be, Elon Musk's, Mark Zuckerberg's, and whatever else that controls the level of information that can be shared. So I'm really grateful for places like the Internet Archive that allows us to archive the past and give access to people to see what's going on. Our next speaker is Brett Wilkins. Brett is from Common Dreams and Ethics in Tech, and has been involved with me since the past 10 years, working on various ethics and tech projects. So thank you so much, Brett. You have the floor.
It's been 10 years, Vahid. Wow. Well,
10 years.
good to see you again. Welcome everyone in the virtual audience tonight, and welcome back to you, especially who have participated in our events before. And it's really good to see some familiar faces and some new ones too on the panel tonight for this, the 74th Human Rights Day. And as Peter mentioned in the previous segment, December 10th marks the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's a document that I felt, continue to feel, would represent an improvement over the anachronistic United States Constitution, because whereas the Constitution confers rights that may have made sense to a bunch of aristocratic white men in the 18th century, its lack of relevant 21st century rights like healthcare, an adequate standard of living, and other basic human needs that our society is perfectly capable of providing to everyone in it if our society really wanted to. It's a glaring problem, and I'm a huge fan of the Declaration of Human Rights. But tonight I've been asked to speak about Ukraine, specifically Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And to be honest, it's a subject that's a little bit uncomfortable to talk about, and we'll get into why. Now, Russia's brutal and illegal invasion and occupation of Ukraine does pose something of a conundrum to many of us on the left. And that definitely includes those of us on the left who report and write on matters of war and peace and human rights for a living. On the one hand, we have our inherent aversion to military aggression and a healthy skepticism of pretextual claims made by invaders. Denazification sure does sound an awful lot like weapons of mass destruction to anyone who's been at this for long enough. On the other hand, we're fully aware of the history of generations of US and NATO provocation toward Russia, before that the Soviet Union, and also of how the US government, regardless who is in power, whether the Democrats or the Republicans, and the corporate media, and all the various parts of the military-industrial complex, stoke the flames of Russophobia and anti-Russian militarism, prolonging a stalemated conflict for monetary and geopolitical gain, and of how the various forces benefiting from imperialism and all the bloodshed, not just in Ukraine, but throughout the world, often hijack a cause for their own nefarious ends. And there's more, like, the biggest winners, no matter which side emerges victorious, will be the weapons makers, whose executives and shareholders grow richer as the death and destruction in Ukraine mount. And let's be honest, we also know about the unsavory nature, and that's putting it lightly, of some of the Ukrainians who are defending their nation and their horrific human rights record in parts of the country and their role in drawing Russia deeper into the conflict. Well, there's a very strong and healthy tendency for leftist writers to reflexively stand on the side of those who oppose militarism, imperialism, and ecocidal corporatism perpetuated and perpetrated by the US-backed order. We can often make excuses why we tend to ignore even the worst crimes of those who oppose our country's crimes. This can reach near delusional proportions sometimes, as when people claim that North Korea is democratic because it's got democratic in the name. I mean, that's insane. It's like saying the United States are united because it has it in the name. I've even heard maligners of socialism say the same thing about Nazi Germany, calling it leftist because it had socialism in the name. Pure lunacy. Just like the spectacle of so-called leftists who are backing a multi-billionaire fascistic autocrat who sits atop a kleptocratic oligarchic system as if he's the ideological inheritor or torchbearer of the Soviet Union, talking about Putin, of course. Now, at Common Dreams, where I work as a staff writer, we generally focus overwhelmingly on the crimes perpetrated by the United States, its allies, and countries, many of them dictatorships that are backed by Washington and Wall Street. The overwhelming bulk of our Ukraine coverage prior to February 24, 2022 was of the variety of sort of like US, NATO provoking Putin, those kind of headlines. Just a week before the invasion, we published a headline amplifying Russian claims that they were not going to imminently invade Ukraine. We've even taken a fair amount of flack and allegations of being tankies, which from what I can discern means some sort of stooge for Putin and Russia. Well, that all changed on February 24th. There's no winning now. Now we're the mouthpiece of US aggression and all that. But the moment those Russian troops crossed into Ukraine, that's when everything changed, because no provocation by Ukraine or NATO justifies an invasion on general principle, let alone an all-out effort to decapitate, perhaps literally if they had succeeded, Ukraine's leadership. Situations like this, and as we've heard tonight, like Iran's murderous crackdown on protesters or China's crimes against ethnic minorities like Tibetans, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, they call for the same strident level of condemnation as when we condemn the US for being the world's leading murderer of foreign civilians over the past 3/4 of a century, or of Israel for its apartheid, illegal occupation, ongoing ethnic cleansing, settler colonization, and other crimes. We must eschew the seemingly pathological intellectual affliction of too many leftists who only see crimes committed by the US and its allies, and not those perpetrated by countries or forces who generally oppose the US. I was with Vahid, and we were rallying in San Francisco here against the Iranian theocracy. And I was really disappointed that not one single human rights or feminist or any other kind of advocacy group took part in the demonstration. There weren't any progressive elected officials or leftist political groups. There were, however, numerous local elected centrist Democrats, opportunists, including people calling for the restoration of the brutal US-backed monarchy that preceded the current regime in Iran. Now, as with Iran, the Russian invasion of Ukraine demands that people who oppose US and Israeli invasions, occupations, and other human rights crimes must stand and speak out against those same sorts of horrors when they're inflicted by Russia against Ukraine. If you believe human rights groups when they report on US crimes, why don't you believe those same groups when they're shining light on Russia's crimes? If you support people fighting against foreign invasion, even when their values don't quite match your own, like Hamas or the Iraqis who resisted US occupation, then why is your first reaction to portray all Ukrainians fighting for their personal and national lives as Nazis? I also find it more important than ever to voice solidarity with people inside Russia who are standing against and refusing to participate in their government's crimes. I mean, it's really easy to sit here and protest and dissent from the comfort and safety of my house in California or anywhere in the West. It's not so easy to do that when it can land you behind bars or worse, as we see in the streets and cities all across Iran right now. Personally, I try to solve the conundrum of being a left-righter faced with Russia's invasion, and Reverend Dorsey poignantly demonstrated examples of this, but I try to personally solve this dilemma by avoiding hypocrisy. And I find that avoiding hypocrisy begins with being consistent. It's not just a matter of principle either. Journalists, writers, and others with platforms for amplification can and do reach large numbers of eyeballs, and even in the echo chamber atmosphere of today's media, our words do have the power, even if only occasionally, to move people's minds. And as Vahid said, no oppression, no dictatorship will last forever. And while the circumstances preceding and precipitating Russia's invasion of Ukraine may be complex, it's not at all a difficult decision to oppose Russia's aggression, just as we ought to oppose all aggression. I don't know about you, but I don't think I could call myself a leftist if I failed to stand in solidarity with oppressed peoples and write about it as much as I can, no matter where they may be. And thank you very much again, Vahid.
Thank you so much, Brett. So I'm going to ask you guys can all unmute your mics. I want this to be an open discussion for the next 15, 20 minutes before we get Karen to share a few poems. If there's anything that comes to mind based on these conversations that you want to highlight, any questions you have for each other, that would be wonderful. Hi, Karen, I see your hand up.
Yes, I came in late, of course, because I was reading at the Zoom for Living Wage, but I did hear the mention of Aaron Schwartz, whom I just hope will never be forgotten, for his downloading JSTOR. I mean, when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, I was always up against JSTOR, and I couldn't get through. And it was just, it's the professors who wrote those things wanted that truth from me. They didn't want it behind bars. And Aaron Schwartz just, I mean, he was such a victim of terrible, just egregious bureaucry and tyranny. So I'm just glad his name was mentioned.
Oh, absolutely. I think Aaron Schwartz did a huge service. If you think about all the scientific publications and who gets to publish them, even though they're paid for by NIH, they're paid for by our tax dollars, by public universities, but a few publications get a chance to publish those, put their copyrights on them and sell them to the highest bidder. And they control who gets the knowledge and who gets to benefit from it. And as the Internet Archive founder Brewster Kahle says, knowledge should be accessible, it should be free. And that's why I believe in Creative Commons. And all the books I ever published are under Creative Commons. I never made a penny from them. And I make them available online. They've been translated, but anybody who wants to read them, they can. And same thing with the work that Aaron Schwartz did, is he took publications that needed to be heard and made that available. Peter, any comments about the Aaron Schwartz Day you attended just a couple of weeks ago?
No, I will echo just what you said, and what Karen just intervened with. That's exactly right. But he's one of many people who exemplify the critical challenge that I was trying to get at in some of what I was saying.
One of the things that I wanted to bring out was the conversation with Tracy in regards to the censorship that we face online. Places like Saudi Arabia and Iran, if you post a tweet, you can get 16 years in Saudi Arabia, be jailed, 34 years in jail for posting a tweet against the government, even though you're a dual citizen of the US and Saudi Arabia. In Iran, I believe now you can get banned from leaving the country. You can definitely get imprisoned for showing your hair on Instagram or doing a post against the government. Your bank account can be frozen. You can be basically followed and put in jail. So it's not just downloading of information, it's just sharing information, even putting up news stories, seeing beatings in the streets or thugs of the regime killing people, and sharing that content online could land you in prison for a long time and could cause your own death. And of course, in Iran, as I said, over 500 people have died, and yet nobody has been prosecuted for those deaths. But they found one dead Basiji, one of the mullah's henchmen, dead, and they put 15 people for his death as responsible for his death, and 5 have been ordered for execution. You're talking about people that are 20, 22 years of age, highly educated, that are being blamed. I believe one is a radiologist and his wife for this death. And it's really disheartening. It's a process of intimidation. I always look at what's going on in Iran as a birth, as a way of anytime a acorn or any kind of a plant seed grows, it goes through a stage where it has to rupture. It has to come out of that shell and blossom. And Iran, there's 18,000 people in jail right now, and soon it's going to blossom, and these people are going to be free. But it's going to take a lot of, unfortunately, pain and suffering for the Iranians in Iran to overthrow this government. So, Tracy, anything you want to add in regards to oppression of people using social media?
Well, I think I would start off by saying, even though it is perhaps not as clear to us to witness, that stuff happens right here at home too. For example, if you happen to be a homegrown activist in Ferguson a number of years ago, you may very well not be alive in 2022. A number of people who were intimately involved with putting together those protests in 2014 are no longer with us. They died under suspicious circumstances. So I think when we talk about censorship, yes, there's more blatant and more, shall we say, underground or filtered censorship. We should be clear that it's a worldwide phenomenon, and no country is exempt, including our own.
I think Sonia was sharing experience of what's going on with some of the Iranian content that's being posted online from being censored in the US. Do you have any examples of that, Sonia, that you would like to share?
As far as content reaching the United States that the United States is filtering?
Yep, the, Meta or Twitter or others are filtering or
Yes.
just,
There have been reports, anonymous reports from former employees of Instagram or Facebook, I believe, that they received bribery or thousands of dollars from Iran to delete certain accounts of adamant human rights activists like Mas Ahmadinejad and other very vocal activists that are speaking for the Iranian people. And it's really frightening to think that we are the mouthpiece of the Iranian people, and even here they have control. And I don't think people realize how entrenched in internationally the regime is. They have people everywhere, and that just adds another wrench in everything that we're trying to do, because people that are not educated on Iran and what's going on want to learn more, and then they're being educated or miseducated, I would say, by these regime supporters that are systematically placed everywhere, and they're being financially supported by the regime. It's a fight of knowledge, I would say.
yeah. I noticed that in the case of Saudi Arabia, that there was an accusation that at Twitter, they had somebody there that would identify activists' accounts. And what scares me about a platform like Twitter is coming out with blue verifications is what's going to happen to activists in the Middle East that want to be heard. Now they verify their accounts, they can easily be identified, they can easily be put in jail in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, even if they can afford to pay the $8 a month to Elon. It just doesn't seem to be a fair way of helping oppressive regimes identify activists for getting their content shared. So that's really disheartening too.
Well, Twitter is an example of a platform. While it was never under grassroots control, it is one that has been co-opted in the sense that it has been bought by a billionaire who at best is a racist, and potentially is considerably worse than that. He comes from an apartheid country, and it shows, a formerly apartheid country.
Yeah.
So it's an example of the kind of co-opting that we're speaking about, that we are constantly subjected to, because the tools that we need are not under our control in any way, shape, or form. And it only gets worse. It doesn't get better.
Yeah.
There is the mythology, which of course has been popularized by many, including those who have a big stake in the technologies, that technology will set you free, which has never been true, but always been popular or popularized by some sectors or some analysts. I mean, it was true. We were told that radio was going to democratize America, that broadcast television was going to democratize America, then cable TV was going to do it. And, Robert McChesney has written about this mythology, and he wrote 25 years ago about how this whole do no evil thing was predictably going to just be exposed as ridiculous. And that if you, as he said, started out in a garage, but sooner or later you will either be subsumed by the corporate structure or you will go under. And certainly that was, prophetic at the time, as it's been borne out ever since. And this faith in technology, I think, is just remarkably pernicious. And, a lot of people are still believing it in some way, that technology will make you free or the internet will make you free. I think the theorist Herbert Marcuse really had it right 50 or 60, 70 years ago when he said that inherently, I'm sort of paraphrasing, I think, there's no technology that's going to be good or bad. I think we could make an exception for nuclear fission. It depends on who controls it, who has the financial and political leverage over it. And so we're seeing this now, clearly with a vengeance. And I think about the concept of freedom of speech. I mean, A.J. Liebling, the press critic, said in the middle of the last century, freedom of the press belongs only to those who own one. And I think it's interesting now to think of that at a much earlier time when the internet didn't exist, And how would we adapt that now? Because it's not quite true. If you can get online, you can have some quote unquote freedom. I think to go to an extreme about the First Amendment, the freedom of the First Amendment can coexist with complete repression. Imagine if you're imprisoned and you're put in solitary confinement and you're told that you can say anything you want. Nobody's going to restrict your First Amendment rights. You're free to talk to all four walls and the ceiling and the floor.
Mhm.
And in a sense, that's where we are. It's more complicated because anybody can just about put up a website, but the
Mhm.
so-called legacy media that dominate all the other forms of media, they are overwhelmingly dominating the internet also.
Yep, rights don't really exist apart from power and from economics. You know, they don't live out there in a vacuum. They can't.
One of the things you pointed out, Norman, is that, tech does no harm. In reality, if you look at but my favorite example is Big Tech Sells War website. It's bigtechsellswar.com, and it highlights how big tech in the companies like the Microsofts, Googles, and Amazon, AWSs of the world sell huge no-bid projects to the defense industry. With the JEDI contract, now it's a $10 billion contract for SaaS products and services for the defense industry. And it's since it's really a monthly or SaaS consumption, it's going to continue to grow year over year. It's not something that you put your content on the cloud and your systems on the cloud, and one day you're going to pull the plug on it. It's only going to get bigger and bigger. So yeah, big tech has got its hands dirty in a lot of wars and conflicts and benefits from it. And I always tell people to get educated about where these dollars are being spent and how these contracts, for example, the $100 billion in arms sales that was given out to 4 defense contractors, over 50% of it given out to 4 defense contractors under Joe Biden, were no bid contracts. Nobody questioned who was receiving this money. And it's taxpayers' money. The whole war in Afghanistan was a great way to shuffle money from the public into the defense industry without any accountability. And yes, do I support Ukraine towards its independence? Absolutely. Do I think that Zelensky is doing a great job uniting his country? Yes. But I also see that Russia and Iran and US and all the great powers are not doing us any favors by selling guns and weapons and promoting their own technology companies.
I think it's also important to say that in addition to selling, tools of death and weapons, when you're talking about big tech, you are also talking about persistent and wide-ranging systems of surveillance, which are being sold to governments, which essentially are creating a chilling impact, which makes it extremely difficult to exercise whatever freedoms you can find. Because when you're being watched every minute, and they've done scientific studies on this, people's behavior changes. So the perception of surveillance changes the way in which people function in response to the larger society, and in a completely unconscious and somewhat uncontrollable way.
Yeah, I mean, there's a fear that comes with that surveillance, either in the States or in China. I was reading an article that said there's over 400 million cameras deployed in China now to watch citizens and what they do and their activities. Well, here in the States, we may not have that many cameras, but we're getting close to it. And we have other ways of monitoring communications through NSA and Patriot Act and all the rest that came with it. So,
and it's not just China. Great Britain is one of the most camera-heavy countries now in the globe.
China must be catching up with London. Then I was going to say,
yep,
can't do anything wrong in that city. I'll see you everywhere you went.
Any questions anyone has from the panel or the folks that spoke already before we move on to Karen?
I wanted to ask Sonia, if you would. We've seen periodically every few years Iranians do rise up. I was wondering if you could say what is different about this time as far as the potential for this to go further and have real meaningful, I'm not going to use the word regime change, but you know where I'm going.
Yeah, I would say the main difference is the unification of the people this time, because it's been a little scattered. They've been very persistent this time and very unified, and it's widespread in the country, and they haven't been stopping. It's not one of those things where the government was relying on it to just die out after a few days, or we'll kill this person and do the old tactic of instilling fear again, hanging people publicly. I think people don't realize how much it shows how little the people have to live for. They don't have anything left in that country. They are young people. They're willing to give their lives. I don't think the government understands how much they've pushed the nation to get to this point, but hopefully they quickly realize and leave. I've heard they're possibly fleeing to Venezuela, the regime officials, but we'll see about that. It's only gotten bigger, especially with the help of social media and other actors and activists and celebrities, people of higher status being able to use their platforms to spread the word of the Iranian Revolution. And I don't see it slowing down.
One of the things I like to say, Brett, is that COVID did the revolutionaries a favor, because everybody had to get a digital device to get to do online work, to get educated with their coursework. So it ended up getting a lot of devices in the hands of kids and accessibility where they didn't have that accessibility before. And even though the government has shut down the internet pretty much and has blocked Instagram and Facebook and social media, but people are still around, able to get around with VPN and Tor and other technologies to kind of stay informed, even though it's at the snarling, slow pace that they're able to do it. But the cat's kind of out of the bag. They have seen the videos, they see the police brutality, and you can't put it back in the bag. It's out there, you know, they're not afraid. And as Sonia says, you know, when you have nothing to lose, you don't have a job, your currency is devalued, the economy sucks. The majority of the young people don't see themselves owning a home, they don't see themselves getting married, having kids. What are you left with? You know, you just take your life on your hands and you go to the protests and hope for change. If we don't have any other comments, I'd like to give the floor to Karen Magoon, to end the night with some poetry so we get out of these dark topics. We usually
I'm a little dark too sometimes, but actually I was a little curious because was not Amini a Kurd? And I'm wondering, just we have, you know, a wonderful global support for Iran, and even local in the areas around Iran. It's not just Iran that is supporting what's happening and is horrified at the murder of Amini. But, you know, I just found that interesting that she's a Kurd, right?
Yep.
Yeah, she's from Kurdistan,
She's
as far as I know. And I found that just really interesting. Anyway, I would like, because we're talking about Twitter, and we were supposed to have a protest right in front of Twitter today, but it was canceled because of the storm. So I'm going to read what I was asked to write something about Musk, and it was supposed to be in relation to the title of the protest, which was "Blast Off for Mars." So here goes. Whither Twitter, racial slurs, homophobic innuendo, election lies, promotion of violence, bullying, transgender harassment, all exploding across his platform. Is this hell's own media outlet, run by a brain without a compass, a rudderless Musk? Whither Twitter, whither Musk? Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry Musk home. Swing low as he could go, pick him up, send him to that band of angels anywhere, blast him off in his space shuttle anywhere, but send him away anywhere but here, maybe Mars. Okay.
That's pretty good. Thank you.
That I was going to read that at the protest, but the protest will happen again in 2 weeks, and I don't know. Elon Musk may have begged forgiveness by then for all of his errors. Who knows? Okay, another person, I noticed that, mentioning Aaron Schwartz, and there's another person that I don't want to be forgotten. She comes from Lake County. Her name is Maria Rutzica, and she spent her life, she died from a car bomb when she was 28. But she spent her life right after graduating from high school. She went from door to door to try to count the civilians who had been killed or damaged, injured, whatever, in Afghanistan and Iraq. So this was Maria Rutzica. Let us not forget Maria Rutzica from Lake County, California, who spent her short life going from door to door in Afghanistan and Iraq to count civilians killed and those who needed aid, founded Campaign for Innocent Victims of Conflict due to US military's policy not to count civilian dead, knowing she must draw attention to the human tragedy of war, killed at 28 from a car bomb while she was traveling to visit an Iraqi child injured by a bomb. She was not targeted, but her death left a great hole in the net of those who will give themselves, will sacrifice themselves to restore the world. I just want these people remembered, that's all. And then I have one on, if I can find it here, on Chaco Canyon, which I just read about. The heart of Four Corners. It's right there, where the four corners come together in our own United States. Chaco Canyon, heart of Southwest Pueblo culture, heart of agriculture, developing from pits and caves to villages and irrigation systems, religious and cultural center of Anasazi, flourishing on maize, beans, and squash. They called them the Three Sisters, building to honor solar and lunar cycles, sustaining their villages through peace, blending with visiting peaceful Navajo, working with nature to grow crops, overcoming drought and even attacks from warring Apache, until a great society crumbled, leaving a mystery and a skeleton of history to be immortalized, to be remembered for lessons learned, to nurture with nature's gifts, to simplify, to live at peace, to watch the phases of the moon and the cycles of the stars, and to help one another. Chaco Canyon, heart of Southwest Pueblo culture, built on pits and caves of early humanity, threatened now by hammers of greed, wielded by hungry fracking dragons who would only ravage its history and swallow its peace. So I think many of you know this was in the news recently, that Chaco Canyon has been targeted for fracking, and it will destroy this whole early civilization. If anybody's been out there to see those ruins, they're just amazing, those caves. So there's so much to be remembered and so much to talk about. I'm doing one that's more tech related called Breeding Robots, and then I'll do a nice softie at the end. Breeding robots, weeding hate, seeding something new, a brew that abjures war, far more create, not hate, abate the failure of humanity to live in harmony, in amity. Today, the robot emulates the man in making war, ever distant isolation, computer-fed annihilation, devastation, desolation. Touch a screen, destroy a dream. If a scream resounds 10,000 miles away, was it a scream? If the robot does not hear it? The drone releases pain we do not feel, as mutilated bodies cannot reconstruct, and pain becomes a language never understood. Breeding robots, weeding hate. Can we sate our appetite for war by making versions of ourselves absent the venom, absent violence, absent desire for retribution, vengeance, murder, substituting purity of heart, of hope? The Tin Woodsman seeks his heart among debris scattered on a yellow road. Start to chart a world littered with destruction. Breeding robots, weeding hate. Could we mate a version of ourselves of pure compassion? Reinvent our history, revive Neanderthal beginnings of agape? Could we find a new humanity free of hate? Celebrate the child, the mild and gentle, love our differences, and place the child again within a heart found throbbing on a yellow road free of destruction.
It's very appropriate for the time that we're having robots discussed in the city of San
Yes,
So-
yes, it
So
seems
the
like
timing was perfect.
if robots are going to take over, let's see, can we make them better than ourselves? Can we work at that? I don't know.
But
Um,
as our
But
partners,
this is my last poem called The World Turns. And I've pasted it up here and I just hope it's all there. The world turns, allowing the sun to warm and light us. Myriad Milky Ways decorate the heavens and all that is beside us. A small child plays with marbles among leaves dappled by light, dancing their own game with tiny fingers among shadows auguring night. While sun and moon and Milky Way, the small and large of life, embrace and tune our day, our wars, our love, our strife. The child and all she sees are equal to the world, and nothing can appease in play or dreams or wondering her quest for thought and new ideas. The world turns now and yesterday as worlds turn everywhere, as galaxies remain and spin through space and time and air, and stars explode and all expands as dark holes remain questions. Yet everywhere life still demands angelic interventions. When we discover kindness, when we discover love, the universe will become whole. Even the stars above will ring throughout the universe, a great unceasing bell, held and rung by angels, rung even into hell.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was
Thank you.
lovely. Thank you. Thank you for sharing those poems.
Inviting me here. I love this group. You are all so wonderful. I love your faces, with or without masks. Beautiful people. Thank you, people.
I want to thank everybody that participated tonight. Sonia, Karen, Brett, Tracy, Norman, Peter, Reverend Blake. Thank you so much for making your time available on a Saturday night. I hope that we can get you back for another event in the new year on better topics, hopefully on discussion of peace, on prosperity in the Middle East and elsewhere around the world. So I keep my fingers crossed, and I wish you all a wonderful evening, and thank you all for being a part of tonight's event.
Thank you,
Feliz
Vahid.
Navidad.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.